Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for Module 4. This is a review of pivot chord modulation, which is a topic we did last year. And so the objectives in this video are to define the term modulation, define the term pivot chord, describe the steps of a pivot chord modulation, and then we'll analyze a pivot chord modulation and realize a figured bass example with a pivot chord modulation. Okay, so modulation is just a shift in tonal center within a movement or a single piece of music. So for example, you can modulate from the key of C major to E major. And the book makes the point about it being within a movement or a single piece of music. And that just means that the change in key from like one movement of a piano sonata to another movement of a piano sonata is not a modulation. So this is something that happens over the course of a single piece of music, okay? It's a transition, not just a key change. So modulations last for an entire phrase or for an entire section of a piece of music. So you could start a piece in C major and then go to E major, and in order for it to be a modulation, that E major would have to last for an entire section or an entire phrase. And that's important because in that way it's different than a tonicization by a secondary function chord, for example. So with those chords, the change in key, the change in tonal center, lasts for only a chord. A modulation lasts for an entire section or a phrase, so it's a much longer term thing. Okay, a pivot chord modulation is one type of modulation, and it's important because it creates a smooth transition from one key to another. And this smooth transition is created by the use of a pivot chord, or also called a common chord. I think the book calls it a common chord. So by using that chord that's in common between both keys, we create a smooth transition from the old key to the new key. And that's because the pivot chord is a chord that exists in both the old key and the new key. So it's like we're pivoting around this common point from one key to another. Okay, so there are sort of conventions or things that normally happen with pivot chord modulation. And one thing that's important is that they usually occur between two closely related keys. And that's because closely related keys have the most chords in common. So closely related keys are simply two keys that have almost all notes in common. They might just have one note difference. So something like the key of C major is closely related to the key of G major, because C major has all white notes and G major has all white notes except for one note, which has an F sharp, right? A black note, F sharp. So those two keys have most of their notes in common, so we call them closely related. Okay, so here's another example of two closely related keys, the key of F major and the key of B flat major. So you can see that F major and B flat major only have one note difference in their key signatures, which just means that they have one note difference in their scales. Okay, so that means that they are closely related. And so you can see that all of these chords, so both keys have F major in common. And I did repeat the accidentals here just to show you which chords are the same. So F major is in common between the two chords, G minor is in common between the two chords, B flat major is in common between the two chords, and finally D minor is in common between the two chords. So those are all the harmonies that they share. They have four chords in common, and you can use any of those chords as a pivot chord to transition between the two keys. All right? You'll notice that the ones that are not in common, such as the third chord there, that's an A minor chord in the key of F major, but the chord with that root is a diminished chord in the key of B flat major, so those are not in common. The fourth chord there, fifth chord there, that's a C major triad in the key of F major, and it's a C minor triad in the key of B flat major, so those are not in common. Okay? All right, so there are three parts to a pivot chord modulation. The first is simply a chord that exists in the old key, and that moves to a chord that is the pivot chord, the chord that exists in both keys. And then finally we have the final chord in the modulation, which we call the point of modulation, which exists only in the new key. And normally, well, usually this is a dominant chord, a chord that will bring us into the new key. It can also be a diminished chord, a leading tone chord, because that has a dominant function, and it can also be a cadential 6/4 chord because that chord also has a dominant function. So it's some kind of chord that will strongly pull us into the new key. All right. So let's do a little refresher of analysis. Now here is a piece of music, a 4-part chorale that begins in the key of F minor. And it looks like it ends in a different key, so this is some kind of modulation. And you'll see that this is just like a snapshot of something, because you could analyze this like a secondary function, but we're going to pretend that this piece continues in the key of where it cadences here. Okay. So first, the thing we want to do is listen to the passage carefully, and I'm going to play this. And when we listen, we want to be trying to find the point of modulation, the place where it sounds like we have keys, or two different keys, and a chord that belongs only in the new key. Okay, so here is this. Okay, and you can hear that it kind of changes gears, right? It sounds like we're heading off in a new direction towards this. So there's definitely a modulation here. Okay, then we want to find the point of modulation. Now this is simply finding the chord that sounds like and looks like it doesn't belong in the old key. So the biggest red flag for the point of modulation will be an accidental, right? Because an accidental will tell you that something is not diatonic. It's chromatic, which means that it will belong in a different key than the key signature. But that can be tricky, especially in a minor key, which we'll see in a second. So we're going to go through this and try to find the point of modulation. So go through here, and we can see that we have a E natural here. So that could be our point of modulation because it looks like E natural doesn't belong in the key signature, right? Because we have an E flat in the key. So that's one possible place. But something that might be an argument against that is the fact that it disappears over here, right? That E natural becomes an E flat. So that's kind of weird. And then finally over here we also have a D natural, which could also be a point of modulation because D natural also doesn't belong in the key signature. So we have to decide which one of those is the actual point of modulation. Okay? And then you have to remind yourself what key you're listening to, and this is the key of F minor. And in a minor key, you have to remember that there are certain accidentals that are technically chromatic to the key, but they also belong in the key too. And one of those is the raised leading tone. And so the raised leading tone in the key of F is E natural. Because that's T, right, in the key of F. So that E natural over here, where I put the first place that might be a point of modulation, is actually not the point of modulation because that's simply just the leading tone in the key of F minor. So since that's just the leading tone, we know that that belongs in the key. So that's okay. That's not the point of modulation. And then, of course, that E flat corrects it anyway, so it was just a temporary thing to begin with. So that's definitely not the point of modulation. Now that D natural, that really doesn't belong because that's not a raised leading tone. That is the raised sixth. So if this were like part of a melody, you might think that it might be just the raised sixth to correct for a leading tone. But that's not the case because it's not followed by the leading tone. So we're going to say that this D natural over here, this is the point of modulation. So we're going to make a note of that. Point of modulation is that chord, the third chord of the second bar there. Okay, then the last thing we want to do is back up one chord from that point of modulation, and that chord is the pivot chord. Okay, so that means that this over here is the pivot chord. And when we do our analysis, that's the one that gets the bracket where we have to analyze it in both the old key and the new key. Okay? And so we know that the old key will be F minor. So let's go ahead and put that over here. Okay, and we can just kind of start from the left and analyze as we normally would. So this first chord has a bass note of F, and I can tell that it's in root position, so this is going to be a 1 chord. Our next chord has a bass note of B flat, and again you can see, because it's a stack of thirds, that this is also in root position. So this is going to be a 4 chord, lowercase. Over here we have a chord with a bass note C, and I can see that we have a 4th here between my C and my F there, so that's a 4. And I can see that I have a 6th between C and A flat, so that's a 6. So I have a 6 and a 4, so that means that this is a second inversion chord, and the bass note is that F there, so it's a 1, 6, 4. We'd expect this to be followed by a 5. And in fact, that is what happens. So in this next chord, we have a bass note C, an E natural, which is the leading tone, a G, and a B flat. So this is going to be a 5, 7 in the key of F. All right. And then this next chord, we have an F in the bass, an E flat in the tenor, an F repeated in the alto, and then a flat in the the soprano. So that means that this is some kind of 7 chord, and it's not a dominant 7th chord, but it notes root position, so this is going to be a 1, 7 in the key of F. Okay. Now we expect this to be the pivot chord, so this should exist in the key of E flat as well. And so in the key of E flat, which is what we're ending on, that is a 2 chord, a 2, 7 chord in the key of E flat major. So that's our pivot chord there. And then that's followed by a dominant chord in the key of E flat. So this is a 5, 7 in our new key of E flat. And then we end on a 1 chord there. Okay. And then the cadence, of course, this is a imperfect, authentic cadence. Okay. All right, so that's how you analyze those. Now let's do a figured bass example. Here's our figured bass example. Now you can see we start in the key of F. We're not given much information about what happens at the end there, but you can see that we do have some accidentals introduced about, 2/3 of the way through this. And so here we get a natural, which means that we're going to have a B natural in that chord. And then here we also have another B natural. And we see that this ends not on F, but ends on C. So what key, we begin in F, but it looks like we're going to a key that has B naturals and ends on a C. So that means that we're modulating to the key of C major. So this is probably going to end in C major. All right. And you can see to the left of that, there's not really any accidentals. There are like sevenths and things like that, but there's no other notes that don't belong in a key. So our point of modulation is probably where we have our first accidental, and then that continues for the rest of the piece. So our point of modulation will probably be the second beat in measure 2 here. Which means that the chord before that is going to be the pivot chord, the chord that exists in both keys. So go ahead and put the little bracket here, and we know that we're going to the key of C major after that. All right, do some cleanup here. All right, and now you can just kind of continue as if you were writing any other 4-part example. So let's start by writing our soprano line, doing as much contrary motion as we can, and oblique motion when we can't do contrary motion, and avoiding parallel fifths and octaves and the like. So why don't we start this on an A in the soprano, and we can create contrary motion with the bass if we move that up by step to a B flat. And then in our next chord here, it calls for a 7th, which above C is going to be B flat, so we can create that by a suspension, by repeating our soprano note, B flat. 7ths always need to resolve down, so our next step is obvious, down to an A there. Okay. Now we want to keep having a contrary motion, and we can have an octave above this G here, so our A could move down to a G. Right, and then our last G here, this requires a seventh, and so we could create that using a passing tone, so we could move our soprano down to an F here to create our seventh, and sevenths seem to resolve down, so that seventh will need to go to an E natural. Okay, so that's a pretty good soprano line. Now notice one thing that I made sure of, and it kind of had to happen because of the sevenths, but we're moving two chords, you know, actually we have three chords in a row that move up by step, and they're not inverted. So in that case, you really have to emphasize the contrary motion between the voices to avoid things like parallel fifths. Because if you don't, you'll definitely end up with parallel fifths. Okay, so let's voice this first chord, and we have our third already. Let's add the root, doubling the root. And then we can also give ourselves the fifth here. Okay, in our next chord, we need a fifth and a third. Our third can come from our tenor, moving up by a step from the C, and our fifth can be created with oblique motion in the alto. Okay, in our next chord, we need a third for sure. Now we can create that in a couple different ways. Let's go ahead and just give that to the alto. So we give the alto the E for the third. Now we're missing a note here because we need a G above this chord for it to be complete. But I think this might be a case where it's okay to have an incomplete chord, because that way we can just have our tenor move back to the C, and leaving out the fifth is okay. So let's just do that. Now in our next chord, this E is the leading tone of the scale, so we do want that to resolve up to an F. And we have a bit of a problem because if we can repeat the root, so if we move to a D in our tenor, that would complete the chord, but we are moving up by step in both of those voices, so that'll create parallel octaves. So I think the best thing for this alto to do might be to have a small little leap to an A, like that. Okay, and then in our next chord, we need a B natural. So it looks like the best place to put that might be the tenor. And then we have a couple of choices with our alto, but why don't we have it leap down to a D? Okay, and then we could have it repeat the D in this chord. Then in our next chord, we could just keep the B in the tenor. And then of course that has to resolve up by step to our C, next chord. And then we have some choices to make with our alto here. It could either go up and double the E as the third, or it could go down and double the root, and we'd have a tripled root. So why don't we just do that? Let's triple the root. Because in general, you don't want to double the third if you don't have to. Okay, let's see how this turned out. Nice. Let's do our analysis. This first chord has the bass note of an F and its root position, so in the key of F, that's a 1 chord. Here we have a bass note of B flat, also root position, so that's a 4 chord in the key of F. Here, another root position chord with C in the bass, so that's a 5, and it has a 7, so we need to call it a 5-7. For here we have another root position chord, which has D in the bass, so that's going to be 6 in the key of F. All right. Now we also want to analyze it in the key of C major, since it's the pivot chord. In the key of C major, since this is a D minor chord, this is a 2 chord in this key of C major. Okay, our next chord, now everything after that chord will be analyzed in the key of C. So next chord has the root of a G, its root position, so that's a 5. Our second to last chord, still another root position chord, the key, the G in the bass, and this is a 5-7 this time. And we end with our final root position chord of C, so that's a 1. And then our cadence, since we end on the third, and we have a 5-to-1 progression, that's an imperfect authentic cadence. Okay. All right, well, there you go. And that movement to 5, by the way, is like one of the most common kinds of modulation. So in a major key, it's very common for the piece to modulate to the 5. In a minor key, it's just as common for the piece to modulate to the 3, which is the relative major of the key. Okay. All right. Well, that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me over email, or you can save it for the Zoom session. We'll be going over an example as well. All right. Well, thanks for watching, and have a great day.